Greetings of the day. It is my pleasure to today have this conversation formally with a very, very dear friend who has been a friend, a colleague in some ways, and a mentor in many ways, a guide, somebody that I call upon pretty much very regularly, sometimes to clear the stuff in my head, and sometimes simply because I just feel the need for a friend. In many ways, a Sathi to me and caregiver Sathi. Naren, you and I have spoken for a very long time about many issues, and I have known a little about your caregiving story and journey. I'm delighted to welcome you to Conversations with Gentle Warriors. You for sure uh, have been one. And I'd like to have your perspective on your caregiving journey and hear from you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Bhavna. Um, yes, of course, we've had very many conversations, long conversations over many years. I think this is the first time sitting in front of a camera. So it's both exciting, it's a little daunting. And I look forward to this conversation. I've been following Caregiver Sati and its evolution over the last 6, 8 years. And so it's been a pleasure to see it grow, add new facets, new services, new directions, new hopes, new dreams, and much more. So it's been a delight to uh, sit by the side and watch this organization unfold. And so I'm happy to be here today in conversation with somebody who thought about it for the first time as an idea. So, and it's an idea whose time has come and who I see is on a roll, and I look forward to being part of this journey over many years to come.
Thank you. Naren, tell us about your being a caregiver. When do you think you recognized being a caregiver? What has your story of caregiving been?
Okay, it's interesting. I have never associated the idea of a caregiver to myself till I probably caregiver Sathi came into existence. I mean, it's neither a label nor a role that I formally understood or assumed that I was playing all these years. So it's been also, in the course of even following the idea of a caregiver, it's also been a little educative. And so let me just briefly talk about, where it all began for me and how it's been over the years. I think it started perhaps in 1976 when probably I was 12 years old. And I think the first direct encounter with caregiving as a role was, when I watched my mother handle my father, who he suffered from chronic renal failure, and 76 he started this journey with dialysis, and progressively I think just simply lost his ability to be on his own feet, move around. So his mobility was impacted. He was thrice in the hospital, and thrice in a week he was in the hospital for about 7, 8 hours, and then the other 2 days of the working week he was in office. And so I watched him up close um as he fell ill, and I think it was fairly clear, even though we were fairly young at that time, that there was a one-way street, and there was no you couldn't reset the clock, you couldn't reclaim time, and that given his condition, he was simply hurtling down a path which was downhill. So in that context, it was interesting. My mother, of course, took the load personally quite significantly. We were four of us, three sisters, and I was the only son. And so she was a caregiver to my father, and she was a mother to us. She had to take care of us. I had a younger sister who was just 10 at that time. So I think it was a difficult phase where each of us did what we could, right? We were not asked. We didn't think of ourselves as caregivers, but we extended in whatever ways that we could a shoulder to my mother, support from my father in whatever way that, for instance, he would be bundled into the car every time he had to go to work or to the hospital because he couldn't walk. So I was the only son. I was 12, but I was, I think, reasonably strong. So I would just pick him up off the bed and then put him in the car. And then he would go. And when he came back, and when I was back from school, about the same time, then we would sort of pick him up, put him back in bed. So things like that, so small things. So either about his food, feeding him, uh, making sure that he took his medicines, making sure that he went to work or to hospital. I mean, both sounded in some ways pretty similar because he would leave the house at the same time and come back pretty much in the evening, as if it was another day in office when he was at the hospital. So I think what we experienced at that time was my mother as the primary caregiver who bore the brunt of the demands, the expectations, the setbacks, the challenges, the disappointments, the emotional upheavals, because we never knew in what shape he would come back from hospital each time that he went, and there would be some good days and some horrible days, and so I think she essentially, and she was my father when he first went to hospital for his dialysis was about 40 or 41. So my mother was about 32 or 33, and by all accounts, it was in the prime of her youth, in the prime of her adulthood, that she had to assume this role as a caregiver and as in some ways, a provider, a protector for the children. So I think all of us did what we could to keep the man in the house comfortable, happy. We indulged his taste in music, sit with him, sing with him. And sometimes when he was in pain, see what we could do, but knowing that we could do very little. I think we also realized that there are some things that are happening around us which are well beyond us, and I think the only choice then at that time was to just carry on, with either a homework or to just sit quietly by his side or read something to him. And yeah, so the whole experience of caregiving was, I think, both one of attention, affection, and just simply plain observation of a man who obviously was suffering, but who never let his suffering come in the way of engaging fully with his children, with his work, with his friends, with his music. So, so I think there was a lesson there for all of us as well, and both in terms of how one could look at life, how one could approach life, and how one could not let setbacks, a health condition, altogether pull you down. So yeah, that's where it started in a way, and I think that's the experience that I fall back on even today most often. That so we didn't think of ourselves as caregivers, for example, at that time. Obviously not. I don't think it's a word that we even understood. We didn't think we were doing anybody a favor. We didn't think that we were being demanded of something which was taking away from something else we were supposed to be doing. I thought it simply just happened quite naturally.
Right.
It's only in the last 35 from 1989, if I could
Mm.
look at it, when my mother came to stay with me. And
Mm-hmm.
that's about 8, 9 years after my father passed away. And I think I
Mm-hmm.
was about 30 or 32 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And at which time I think she was hit very badly by rheumatoid arthritis and she could barely walk.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I suspect that the many years of caregiving for my father
Yeah,
took its toll. And
for sure.
I think she aged rather quickly,
For sure.
So even by the time she was 40, when she was
Mm.
40, she could barely walk. And
Mm.
so rather than run her own establishment separately, and I was in
Mm.
Delhi at that time. So
Mm.
I told her you should move and stay with me. I just got
Mm-hmm.
married.
Mm.
And I recall, I don't think it was much of a discussion or negotiation. It just simply understood that
Mm.
if she was not able to carry on her own,
Mm.
she just had a place in what I called my home in
Mm.
Delhi. So that's when she started and she came to live with me. And she's
Mm.
been with me since 1989. Yeah. And
Mm.
over the years, what I've seen in front of my eyes unfold is, I think, bit by bit, from head to toe, if I were to just draw the image of a human being, and many of the diagrams will have arrows coming out of various parts of the body. Instead of saying
Mm.
eyes, I would say cataract. Instead of head, I would say, transient ischemic attack. Kidneys,
Mm.
I would say kidney stones. Pancreas,
Mm.
I would say diabetes, insulin dependent. If I look at, if I point to the joints in the body, I would say rheumatoid arthritis.
Mm.
Heart, I would say, yeah, hypertension. It is like a mosaic of infection, diseases, and health,
Mm.
undesirable health conditions over the years.
Mm.
So, um, so she's in some ways been under my watch, under my care,
Mm.
and nothing that, in my experience, seemed like a major demand or a burden. And neither did I feel that I was doing anything more or less than what I suppose any son would do or any child would do for their parents. So I have not placed it in any particularly significant category of uh,
Mm.
um, service I do, or any particular category of resources I provide or something. It's simply the fact that we have somebody who's very near and dear, who's brought me up, who's been a significant influence in my growing up, and has been responsible in spite of some adverse conditions for my own growth and
Mm.
my own
Mm.
development. And she had as much of a claim to my house and my time and my family
Mm.
as anybody else. So
Right.
therefore, when the question comes, so what's been the caregiving journey? I am a little lost to really ask, figure what is it that I'm doing especially for her
Right.
that qualifies to come under this banner.
Mm.
The way that I've seen it is that
Mm.
initially,
Mm.
when she had her ailments,
Mm.
she reported to me. She
Mm.
took some help in fixing up some lab work.
Mm.
She went on her own. She managed it. She
Mm.
bought her medicines. I funded it maybe, or she managed it herself. But that
Mm.
was, I think, one phase of. Uh, the second phase was where she required me to accompany her, or where she needed some help, some support,
Mm.
physical
Yeah.
presence, for to deal with some of her issues.
Right.
And then over the last few years, she has come to a realization that many of the issues that she confronts today, or the degree of degradation of her health,
Mm.
is such that it's more due to aging, and there aren't any solutions to them. And so caregiving in this phase, as I see it, has largely been around simply being available to listen, and offer, that I can take you to a doctor, or we can try this, or we can try that. But most of the time, I think, particularly in the last 2-3 years, I think she realizes that many of her conditions, health conditions, there are no cures and there is no remedy. They just have to be endured, and that she's likely to have good days and not so good days. And so part of what I do is really to do a quick inventory of what are the pain areas for the day. Literally, not in management lingo, but what are the pain areas for the day. And so she will list out, and then I say, so what do you want to do? We go through this drill, and she will say, no, I don't think anything can be done. I don't think there are no medicines for these things. I just have to live with this, etc., etc. And then try and make sure that her creature comforts are taken care. That when she wants to have a conversation, be available, but it's not easy. One of the things that I'm struggling quite really is to be able to have a conversation with my mother quite often, because otherwise she's quite lonely because there's nobody else in the house. And most conversations often end up going back to 30 years back or 40 years back, and the same stories that I've heard about 50,000 times. So it's not always very easy to be patient, but that's one thing that I need to bring forth in abundance when I'm dealing with her. And there are times when she just feels the weight of her own life and her own story, and she feels a little sorry for herself sometimes, and other times she feels that she's been a feisty fighter over the years. And so I think our conversations often play with some of these themes of regrets, angst, unsettled, unresolved angst, unfulfilled desires, people in her life whom she has lost over the years, and stuff like that. But so company, loneliness, the need for connection, these remain pretty strong. And she's found her own ways. Got her phone, so she's on Facebook. She's got her WhatsApp groups, a dozen of them. She has more messages and more calls coming to her than to me. So it's an interesting existence where I watch her. And these days, there's not much I can do other than to just watch her handle her, shall we say, end of days, so to speak. Just with her phone in her room, on conversations, do as much as she can by herself. I think that's so some of the things that I think, had to struggle with, quite honestly. I don't know if that's a word I would use. But I have always believed that people should manage their own affairs as long as they can. So how far to push and how far to allow a certain dependency to creep in. And it's the dependency that comes in, entertained wholesomely, or with a certain degree of irritation, anger, and a reluctance to even receive. And I struggle with this quite often, because I'm afraid, for instance, that if I gave in to her needs for dependency beyond a point, then she would lose her own capacity to, take care of herself, that she would find her own faculties erode in some ways, and accelerate in the erosion of it. So there's something that I keep, I think, oscillating here, there, all over the place. I'll pause.
Yeah. No. Thank you. It gives a good context in terms of what kind of caregiving you have seen or experienced or been um, over the last many years, 35 years uh, and more. Um, First off, I wanted to say maybe it'll be a good idea to get Auntie to be one of the conversations
We'll be
as
happy to.
well. Yes.
We'll be quite
So I
happy
think,
to. And it's a little hard of hearing now. That
yeah,
is a little bit of a challenge, as you call it, but she'll be quite
yeah.
happy to, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the things we should do is hear her story for being in the 70s, being the primary caregiver, being a young woman with 4 children. It's a story worth listening to.
So I think so. Left to me, and if she was willing, I would write a book on her life.
I think we
I still
should.
might do that.
Yeah, I think we should. Interestingly, just this morning, I was listening to Jimmy Carter's description of his mother and a book that he has written on his mother. So, a remarkable mother,
Hmm.
and how interestingly, Jimmy Carter's father was the kind of person that he was and eventually had pancreatic cancer. His mother was a nurse. So it's very interesting that I should have had that experience this morning and I'm talking to you now. Uh, just connecting some dots here.
Yeah,
And for sure, I think we should write the book, an auntie, and definitely talk to her.
sure.
Um, I would like for you to tell us a little bit about your father and who he was, what was his work, that you spoke about, that he went to work and you were a 12-year-old who used to help him get into the car. So tell us a little bit about him and what it meant to be a young person who saw caregiving so close or who was involved with caregiving. And you can imagine that there are a very large number of such young people today in our country, even today, and will continue to be. So we'll get to the second part of it
Sure.
after.
Okay. My father was, if I recall, the only son.
Mm,
He had a stepbrother, but
mm,
otherwise he was the only son of the, and he academically was brilliant. That's what I hear. I think he, in whichever university, I think it was Madras University or whatever that was, I think probably was a rank holder. He had a difficult childhood from what I can see, in the sense that
mm,
he lost his father very early.
mm,
So it almost seemed like one facet of the drama that's kind of
mm,
spilling over across generations, including
mm,
where my daughter now doesn't have a mother.
mm,
She lost her mother early. Um,
mm,
so yeah, so he had, I think, a difficult childhood. He lost his
mm,
father early, and
mm,
I think he was very much a family man, and so I think he found
mm,
his closest friends and the joy in the company of
mm.
people in the family and the extended family.
Right.
And yeah, so then I think he appeared for the civil services exams
Okay.
because I think my uncle prodded him or something.
Mm,
Got through it. I think the
mm,
second or third attempt, I'm not sure.
mm,
And then he joined the Indian Railways account
mm,
service. So he was an IRAS
mm,
officer. So he
mm,
moved around places.
mm,
And I think when last we were in Gorakhpur, that's when I think some inkling of his declining health started showing
mm,
rather early.
mm,
I think he was about 40 or 41 at that time.
mm,
So then he took a transfer, came to Chennai. Because Chennai is the center of the world. So he came back home to Chennai and continued to work till his very end. That's so on days when he couldn't go to office because
Mm,
the previous day's dialysis wore him out. And
mm, mm.
files would come home. He
Wow.
would still put in his few hours at
Mm,
home. So I think till the very end, I think he worked. And on days
mm,
that he couldn't, uh, he would fidget around and I think be on the phone for some time. Dialysis was not a happy situation for anybody because it took him away from the house and his work for almost the whole
yeah.
day. It was an unrelenting, punishing,
Mm,
non-stop schedule because when you start it,
mm,
the only way it ends is either you do a transplant or
mm,
you die at the end of it.
mm, mm.
Because and we're talking 1970s,
Yeah. Yeah.
technology wasn't
Yeah.
what it is today. Medical
Yeah.
equipment weren't what they are today.
Right.
So, somebody, I think he bore it quite well. Uh,
Mm,
a couple of years down the road after he fell ill and he started on his dialysis, he reached a point where he couldn't walk because some other
mm,
infection took over and I think it completely killed him. He just
mm,
couldn't walk after that without support.
mm,
So part of, I think, our routine game was to somehow incentivize his walk within the house a little
mm,
bit every day. And he would
mm,
give his reasons and excuses. And, we
mm,
would, of course, be very unforgiving and
mm.
egg him on. Uh, of course, with the hope that, maybe it makes a difference and he would someday find enough strength in his muscles to be on his own feet. So I remember him as a man who was very upright,
Right.
who bore his health struggles quite stoically in a way, fairly uncomplaining. Um, as long as he had his family, his cousins, and his aunts and
Mm,
uncles visit him every once in a while, and in whose
mm,
company he reveled,
mm,
life could just carry on. So
mm.
he loved his kids in his own way. He had a he laughed a lot. He loved a lot, and he was he was a bit of he was tall and big, but he was very gentle. He was like a bit of a gentle giant in that sense.
Mm,
Who then, of
mm.
course, eventually shrunk to being a very pale shadow of what we knew him to be. But that's what it was.
Being a young person and watching one's father be unwell is something I relate with as well. And of
Yeah,
course, I was a little older, but I can understand being a teen and having the person that you have seen in a certain way suddenly deteriorate, not suddenly so much, but steadily deteriorate
yeah,
um, every day
yeah,
has a very corrosive nature.
yeah.
Uh,
True. I think I would have every day, every other day when there would be some signs of distress or discomfort. I would often ask myself, is today the day?
mm,
Is it going to be today?
mm,
So this threat of losing somebody,
yeah.
hung in the air for a good 4 or 5 years till
Mm,
the morning that I rushed him to the hospital and didn't make it.
mm.
And there was no way to know that, that would be the last. So yeah,
Yeah, and that's poignant, right? And that's dreadful um, when you're aware, and I suppose that's the whole anticipatory grief and
yeah,
the inability to then once the sword has fallen, um, I wonder how is that? Do you recollect? Would you be okay to talk about it? I'm sorry if this is bringing back anything.
I've been over this many times, and
I'm
I think
sure.
it's too far back in time to believe that it bothers me today. I I think for the first few days, as being the only son, uh,
Mm,
there were expectations of me, in terms of
yeah.
how to finish with the rituals of
Mm,
goodbyes and customs and
mm,
so on, all that.
yeah.
And then it was back to college. Actually, I was about 17 at that time. I just finished first year college, 17 and a half.
Mm,
And nowadays people finish school at that age. Uh, so I finished first year college. So my second year had just started, the third semester. So I was back to college. I think it
mm,
took many months to um, really allow for the sense of loss
mm,
to even penetrate the skin.
mm,
I think we were too caught with the transition. We were in a
mm,
railway colony. Suddenly we were yanked out of that
mm,
place to move to
mm,
my grandparents' place. It was
yeah.
a whole new environment that we were in.
Mm, mm,
There was a life of privilege of a certain kind that we lived when we, as part of the,
mm,
the railway fraternity, and quite another when we were part of
mm,
our grandparents
yeah.
setup. So,
Yeah.
so just going through the transition of
Mm,
place, people, uh, took a while, and there wasn't
mhm,
time to really sit back and ask, what have we lost?
mm,
So um, I think it took me, I think probably what, 1893. So 1893 is about. I think it was in 1993, about 4.5 years after I lost my father.
yeah.
I think was the first time I came to confront the fact that I lost. I lost him,
Yeah.
missed him, and
Mm,
what he meant to me. So that was
mm,
what, 4 years, yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, and so by then I was working, and
Mm,
a very different world opened up. It was time
mm,
to, not look at the absentee father who will help you make your choices, but to just go and take a plunge and see where it takes you. So that's what happened.
yeah. We've spoken so many times, and I have read your very beautifully written blogs and, sometimes earlier posts. Um, and I have resonated or related with a lot of what you have said. Even now, I think this idea of taking so much time to just recognize what it means rings home personally for me. And I understand that. And I can only imagine how hard it must be to even talk to friends about what's going on. I mean, like our home is a little different from other homes, and life is a little different. But thank you for sharing this. Sorry, you were saying something.
I was just saying that at least in our household,
Mm,
which I'm not sure how similar or different it is with other families and other
mm,
households. I think we've
mm,
lived through a lot. We lived a life which was essentially a pact of silence. We very rarely go back to the times when he was
yeah.
there, or the time when we lost him,
Mm,
and what it meant to each one of us.
mm,
So therefore, I think I have found the space to work through how I felt and how I dealt with it in spaces outside the house,
mm,
with friends, with stranger groups, in labs.
mm, mm.
So it's been a very different experience.
Yeah. I can again relate with the idea of everybody wanting to be strong for the others and not realizing that
Yeah,
it is having an impact. And also it is difficult. I don't think that there is a premium to moving on and get on with your life and not really go back and talk about a set of things,
yeah,
especially stuff that makes you emotional.
absolutely. Also, look, at that time, our resource base was very, very poor. My mother had
Mm,
to take up a job, uh, at a time when she was physically not in any great shape.
mm,
Because I was still in college, my younger sister was in school, my two elder sisters were just finishing college around about that time. So there were issues of family, household, children, college,
mm,
work, life, all of that looming large. And so she
mm,
took up work to put food on the table. So I think, given all that, and under some difficult circumstances,
mm.
I think it was an indulgence to think about, oh,
Yeah,
how low I'm feeling, how sad I'm feeling. Those, I think those just didn't enter
luxury.
the frame. Those just didn't
Yeah,
enter the frame. I think we simply
yeah,
just found a way to pull together. And,
yeah,
we knew we had to make our own lives.
yeah.
Were not, we didn't have connections to sort of pave the way for us, and we had to make our own
Mm,
paths, uh,
mm,
however old or young we were at that time.
mm,
And so I think the circumstances were also such that we just grew up and grew out of whatever despondency and whatever sorrow and whatever sadness and whatever grief that
mm,
may have sort of lurked around. You just sort of
mm.
shrugged it off.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it works for many things as well. Do you remember that period for any friends of your parents or family that played a significant role in terms of either support to your dad or your mom or to you?
I think when my father was around, there was a whole uh, army of cousins and
Mm,
aunts and uncles. So they would keep popping in. Now,
mm,
it's because he hailed from a fairly large family.
mm,
They would show up, and
mhm,
so that was helpful in some ways. It strained the system
mm,
in some ways,
mm,
and but I think it kept him happy.
mm,
And it was just a phase when I think things got a little tough because he was the subject of a transplant came up. I
mhm,
remember, and I think close family donors were preferred
mm,
to enhance the probability of success for a transplant.
mm. Yeah.
And I think around that time, uh, visitors dried up
Mm,
for a good few months. I
mm,
I suspect perhaps people were afraid that they may be approached
mm,
to ask if they would donate a kidney. So they just kind of
mm,
that was a little that was sad. It was
mm,
unfortunate, and
mm,
it was angering in some ways. I mean,
mhm,
there was nobody who was going to come out of the scalpel to scoop out your kidney. So there's actually nothing to fear. But I think they simply
mm,
found it very awkward to even
mm,
show up. So that was I think just the brief period when this was not a very happy place. But otherwise, there were loads of family. My father used to be in CMC Vellore at least 3 to 4 months in a year for some reason or the other.
mhm,
So my grandparents would shift base and stay with us because my mom would be with my father in Vellore. So the grandfather and grandmother took charge of the house. So they became, what shall we say, proxy parents for a while, every once in a while, not for a while, but every once in a while. So yeah, I recall going to Vellore once in a while to relieve my mother and stay put with my father in the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who else? I think that's about it. Essentially, it's my world had mostly been friends. And my world was essentially outside the house most of the time. So I found a very different space and different set of people to sort of spend my time and not get too bogged down with the heavy hearts of the house.
Right.
Just in some ways a little cruel, a little insensitive perhaps. But in those days, I was probably an angry young man who thought the world was doing it to him. So
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think just making meaning of all that's going on can be challenging, especially for a teenager who is trying to figure out so many things. And it's a different. So, how do you see your role? Because the way that I relate with it, there is your own caregiving that you have to do as a young person, but you don't think of it as caregiving, but you do see the primary caregiver, your mother. I saw mine, and they are being the caregiver, and caregiving is taking them away from you as well. So in a way, it's not just the absent father. Sometimes the mother is also equally absent,
yeah,
busy with the caregiving, and that has its
totally. We believe we just grew up on our own, which is
yeah.
a little unfair, but it's probably true as well in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. Or like there are other parents, so there's the grandparents, or there's a little bit of yourself, and then there's the idea that the parents are around but not really around. um and so moving to later, your second kind of caregiving,
Second
more
innings.
prime. Sorry.
My second innings.
Your second innings, second kind of caregiving, or second innings of caregiving. And I'd like for you to help us build some kind of perspective as you started seeing yourself as a caregiver, whenever that was.
Sure.
And how did that help or not help, or make it harder or easier?
All right. Some of what I say I might have already said, and I might be repeating myself, but maybe I'm a little clearer now after just unleashing a little while ago.
You didn't unleash.
As I said, no, I think I spoke without interruption, without a pause, without a full stop, without breathing for about 20 minutes. That apart. As I said, my primary responsibility to provide care, I think, began somewhere around 1989, soon after the marriage. And
Right.
to the time when my mother's condition, because of her arthritis, was such that she couldn't walk, without support, without pain. She really struggled. And that's from the time when I said, I think you should chuck your job. I'm working. My sister by then was already working. I said, look, जितना घिसना था घिस गए, अब बंद करो. Okay, I think you've done enough. And and I said, come and stay with me. Because running your own establishment also will necessarily demand a certain degree of physical exertion, which I didn't see her in a position to do.
Yeah.
So about 89 was when I think she moved in.
Mm.
Um, I I think one of the critical elements in this making
Mm.
it work, I think, was simply the
Mm.
fact that my wife, uh, we didn't really have to spend too much time even saying, "Oh, this is going to happen. This is going to intrude into our life and our space and our future." None of this. And
Mm.
I think it was a matter which we settled in 5 minutes. I simply said, I think she had also seen when she came for our wedding
Mm.
that my mother was in no shape. I said, look, I don't
Mm.
think she can continue on her own. I'm asking her to come with us.
Mm.
Sure.
Mm.
And so I think, and I can imagine, and I've seen it in other friends and families' environments, that somebody coming, shifting in to stay with you when, you supposedly are, flying with wings, okay, might seem, is treated a bit like a dampener.
Yeah.
Fortunately, it wasn't the
Mm.
situation in my case. Um, and I and I think it is also my mother who did her level best to let us know that we are the masters of the house. The sense that there was no question of this mama's boy who sort of has to be
Mm.
sort of kept under
Yeah.
leash. I think she was very clear that she was not taking charge. And
Mm.
in any case, with me, it wouldn't have worked.
Mm.
And so she allowed herself to not be the anchor
Mm.
of the house and be another member.
Mm.
She is very undemanding, actually. And she's quite
Mm.
uncomplaining and undemanding,
Mm.
and pretty much would like to do as much as she can by herself. That's how
Mm.
she's been throughout.
Mm.
Fairly independent,
Mm.
strong, and
Mm.
quite willing to give it if something's not going right, right? So uh, she made it easy for us as well. Let's put
Mm.
it this way,
Mm.
by simply knowing that she,
Mm.
she will manage herself to the most extent, and
Mm.
so there was no major demand at that time except
Mm.
the unconditional space that she experienced in her house as a
Mm.
member of the house.
Mm.
Uh, and she knew that she simply had to ask if there's something that she needed.
Mm.
And we tried our best to see that she didn't need to ask. And before she did ask, that we would make some things available. So I think it worked quite well. I think our orientations are a little different.
Mm.
My wife's orientations were different. For
Mm.
example, with respect to issues related to uh, religiosity,
Mm.
customs, rituals, and
Mm.
stuff like that. But I think we managed it in a way that none of these became flashpoints.
Mm.
Okay. And she never flinched when it meant that she had to also extend a certain level of care, concern, love, and affection. So actually, it was a fairly happy experience overall
Mm.
in that phase. Where things got a little difficult
Mm.
was when Mook had, she became afflicted with multiple ailments.
Mm.
And then it became a question of balancing medication, balancing diet,
Mm.
balancing habits,
Mm.
which was an optimization of multiple things. That was difficult, but I think it was more difficult for her. I don't think we did anything particularly specific, special, or out of the ordinary for her. We were there. We helped her see what needs to happen. We took her to the doctors that are relevant,
Mm.
um, and just simply made sure that her creature comforts were not compromised at any time. Her own nook for her gods and her prayers, were
Mm.
always available.
Mm.
Okay, and I think we probably may not value this as much, but I think solace,
Mm.
prayer, solace, uh, a quiet space, many of these do seem to matter.
For sure.
And so I don't, at least for me, mercifully, in my case, it does not expect that I partake in her religiosity or her rituals or
Mm.
her prayer or any of it.
Mm.
And so it is much easier for me to simply make some of those arrangements for her so that she
Mm.
carried on. I think she was quite content. Right?
Mm.
So as you will see, for me, I've just been a chronicler of her various ailments over time. Okay. I've been
Mm.
present almost every day to really know. Often we say, what's the flavor of the day? I ask her, what's the pain of the day?
Mm.
Because each day could be something very different and very severe.
Mm.
Okay. So that's what I end up doing. And yeah, I don't know what else to add to this, but this is by and large how life has been. The issue is that since she cannot move around, somebody has to be at home
Yeah.
at all times. And increasingly, more and more in the last year or so, it's hard to leave her alone in the house without
Mm.
somebody being around
Mm.
more than an hour or so.
Right.
So which means my travel
Mm.
uh, and my social engagements, um, I have to carefully calibrate with my sisters,
Mm.
and ask them to take some time out and come and spend with my mother so that I can
Mm.
step out. Even when my wife was there, it's interesting. She used to travel very extensively.
Mm.
She used to do the international circuit. I did the national circuit. That's the only difference.
Mm.
She was her wages were in dollars, mine were in rupees. With that apart, we made sure that as much as possible, that our
Mm.
lives were calendar coordinated.
Right.
That one of us is invariably here
Mm.
at home, while the
Mm.
other is traveling.
Mm.
I think it had multiple benefits. Of course, one is for my
Mm.
mother, the other is for my marriage. It did
Mm.
wonders that we were not here at the same place all the time. So that is good.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, as you were describing this, images were coming up for me, and I was relating with women of a particular generation. So it led me to think about my grandmother and her relationship with religion and rituals. And, at that time, her, having that routine of morning, I must do this. And, there was a pretty much standard routine, and, it would take a long while. And, but now, many times, my mother and I speak about it, and we say it's such a wonderful thing to have a morning ritual and a routine and a certain quality of faith, um, for your resilience and hope. Otherwise, it can be quite harsh. Uh,
So I I can just add a couple of things which come to my mind. I don't know if it's in any particular sequence, but I think part of caregiving
yeah.
involves letting the person know that they're cherished and they're loved. I think it's not about what you do, but also,
Yeah.
for me, it's often been that in the doing is what I think I'm expressing how I feel. But
Mm,
I suspect that may not be enough.
yeah.
It has to be articulated. I don't do
Yeah.
a great job of it, but I see that I think there is a need for it. That's one. I think the second thing that I see is that they'd like to be acknowledged for what they have done for you. Because part of the stories that keep coming back are
Yeah.
reminders at one level of how life was, but it's also letting that these are some things that I've done in the
Yeah.
course of your growing up and in the course of your
Yeah.
becoming an adult and so on.
Yeah.
And I think simply acknowledging it and saying how much it's valued, I think is very useful. I think
Yeah.
I suspect in her case, for example, it's a bit like a balm.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
And I think at least in her case, I can see that she knows she's 83 now,
Mm.
and she's not quite sure how many more years she has. But
Mm.
by the normal understanding of people who she's seen in her life, she knows how many years or how much longer that
Mm.
she might be.
Mm.
And I think part of caregiving, I think at least with the elderly, is also I think figuring how to talk about death.
For sure.
And
Mm.
um, because there is a fear,
Mm.
uh, there is a fear of the afterlife,
Mm.
and which well, in my own space and in my own time, I might laugh at it, but that
Mm.
fear is real. And so, how does one talk about
Mm.
impending death? That is an inevitable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how does one prepare? Is
Yeah.
something that I'm not sure I have cracked it or I've understood it,
Mm.
but it's something that I do have a chat about with her,
Mm. Mm.
sometimes in jest, sometimes to just sort of, uh,
Mm.
you know, deal with her fear and her panic about it.
Mm.
Um, and related to it, I think also that I've seen is that they would like to have some reason for being, some purpose to why I'm around still. For example, in my case, I suspect she thinks she's here because otherwise I would feel alone.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And so at some point, I've had this conversation where I've had to tell her, look, I've I'll manage myself quite well. If you have to go, if it's unbearable, if your pain is too much, if your suffering is something beyond what you're able to grin and bear, and if you have to go, please go. I don't know if it provides her any comfort,
Mm.
but I think they should feel free not to go, but at least to be free when they go.
Yeah.
This- The moment is not in my hands, but at least my state of being,
Yeah.
I can still manage. So part of what I've tried to do with her is to let her know that she doesn't have to carry anxieties on my count. She
Yeah.
sometimes perhaps forgets that I'm 61 now.
You are the little son. You are the son, little son, always. And which, like, in a way that's, I think it's good, right? Uh,
Um, the other thing that
for
I wanted to just add, I know it's well past the time, is
no, we have all the time. Don't worry.
around this time, around this age, around this time, I think people tend to start getting forgetful.
Yes.
And so I've had to deal with my own annoyance with her
Mm.
inability to remember
Yeah.
small things, simple things,
Yeah.
dates, time,
Mm. Mm.
and having to repeat things once too often.
Yeah.
Um, I think the wisdom is only after the fact, and
Yeah.
most of the time the irritation is writ large. And then
Yeah.
to tell myself, she can't help it.
Yeah.
And just be grateful that she's curious.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing that's more recent. And I'm not
Mm.
quite sure what this means. But my biggest fear, of course, is that she would forget and take her insulin shots twice instead of just once, and not
Yeah.
that she's taken twice. That can be lethal. So
Yeah.
that's my biggest anxiety now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the tasks, one of the things that we have to think of doing as the adult in the relationship is to start thinking of what can be systems that can work for us. So what can be reminders, and what can be, in
I
fact, I
think
was,
you maybe spoke about it once, if I remember. Absolutely.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. I was talking to someone, an aunt of mine, and she was also saying that she's very upset with my uncle and having to remind him again and again, and she gets tired, and she doesn't know where that's coming from. So suggested to her, she said, but it's my home, and I don't want to have a whiteboard in my home. So I said, well, it might be a good idea for you to have a whiteboard and maybe write down a few things, and label a few things, and maybe have some ways of remembering. For some reason, whether it is menopause or I don't know, I didn't have COVID, but it is menopause, certainly. I'm having brain fog, and I feel that having reminders and some kind of labels and some kind of even rituals. So, for example, I've started doing things like, in this bag, I'm going to keep my keys in this pocket, and just that much, right? So that I'm not flustered and I'm not looking for it again and again. I think I just being organized in a different way for people who are forgetful is such an important thing. I also wanted to talk about, there's a tool, and I'm probably motivated by your conversation. It's called the 5 questions, which is to help us as family members talk about death and talk about things that are difficult to talk about. um, for example, to be able to talk to somebody about what are the 5 things that what are the things that they would want, they wish for, when they are not able to take decisions for themselves, their being, their health. So there are, how would they like to be remembered? And things like that they are very, very hard conversations. In fact, one of my biggest regrets is, I think my father wanted to have that conversation with me, and I just didn't know how to have that conversation at that stage. So one of my things is, how can I help others have that conversation? So separately, we will talk about the 5 questions. We'll probably link that from this conversation as well, for those who may want to know. But for sure, having a conversation about one's own death is a hard one.
Yeah.
And I think it is a bittersweet thing, right? To talk to a parent and say, I'm okay for you to go. It can mean I have the comfort, but it can also
Totally.
mean the loss of significance in some way. So it's not an easy path to
Yeah.
tread.
Yeah. That is true. And I think, yeah, you're right. And suddenly the person at the receiving end of this conversation could suddenly feel abandoned, potentially.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
so we tend to be protective for that as well.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that you may have the difficulty and may want to do it in light humor is because you don't want the other person to feel that. Uh, and therefore,
Yeah.
it is a hard conversation.
That's
What
true.
I'd like for you to talk about is, so this whole thing of discovering that today I'm a primary caregiver, I'm a caregiver, and therefore here are a few things that I can do or not do. If you were to look back and reflect, are there things that you would do more of, you would do differently? What would you tell some of the others who are probably going to step into caring for older adults or family members?
A couple of things come to mind. One, no amount of time that you spend, you know, with somebody who you're taking care is enough.
Mm.
And so, how much is enough is a question which is very hard to answer. Perhaps there's
Right.
no answer to it. But I think spending time, uh, is both a gift to the other person and I think to yourself. And I think we
Yeah.
underestimate, what's the payoff if you want to talk in those terms. But what is it
Yeah.
that you receive in the act of caregiving? I think
Mm.
rather than end up thinking in terms of how, as a caregiver, the recipient,
Mm.
is well taken care, well provided, well nourished, and,
Mm.
soul drenched, and so on. I think if we can simply just ask ourselves, you know, do we really have a sense of how much we've received in this process of caregiving? And how has it made us more as a person, okay, than where we started from? I think that will be immensely valuable. And I think I came upon this point of reflection quite late,
Mm.
because I think I was too caught for a long time in the um, acts of acts associated with caregiving, okay,
Mm.
which is around creating the space, keeping my mother comfortable, making sure she didn't have a wish that she had to state before, and then to wait,
Mm.
things like that. So it has a lot, I think, focus around doing and uh, setting up,
Mm.
um, whether it's medicines, hospital visits, labs, food,
Yeah.
diets, whatever. I think the attention was largely around that. But I think
Mm.
what's perhaps more valuable,
Mm.
I mean, what I said is necessary, but not sufficient. I think that's the language which is, I think, appropriate. What's what will be sufficient?
Before you go further, yeah, before you go further, how has caregiving been a gift for you? What has it
I
given
mean,
you?
I think in two, three ways. And I think it's a very recent um, experience and a reflection on the experience. I think
Right.
one, it goes past my crusty exterior and helps me access a part of me that's very, very soft.
Right.
Okay, that's one. I don't know whether it makes sense,
Mm.
but that's one. Second, I think it helps me exercise my empathy muscles.
For sure.
All right. And it's quite easy to uh, think that acts of provisioning is a sufficient substitute for, you know, uh,
Mm.
expressions of empathy. And I
Mm.
think I've come upon an understanding that the two are very
Mm.
different. And
Mm.
again, one is necessary, perhaps, but not sufficient. So, yeah. So, these are two that I see as gifts of the caregiving experience.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it's helped me with, both in my dealing with my father and with my mother,
Mm.
is that it makes it a lot more easier for me to be available
Mm,
to others
mm,
in their moments of need.
right.
And I like the thought
Mm,
uh, of seeing myself as being available to somebody's
mm,
need. And
mm,
uh, yeah, so, and if it made some difference
mm,
to that other person,
mm,
I think it's a day, it's been a worthwhile day. And I think
mm,
these are days that I would count as of value.
mm,
Um, Not value as in, uh,
mm,
in a valuation sense, but value as in a cherishing
mm,
sense. Yeah.
mm.
I don't know if that answers your question.
It's your answer. Um, Naren, one other question that came to my mind, and I'd like for you to talk about is what do you think others who are stepping into caring for someone else could be mindful of or learn from your experience or your journey? What could they do more of? Of course, you said provisioning or providing for or doing tasks is not enough. Give time, be present. Those are some of the things that we need to be mindful of. We could be better at. What are some of the other things?
I think more broadly speaking, I think you already used the word. I think it would help to be just mindful
Mm,
because you don't quite fully understand the state of mind, of the other person,
mm,
and what they're saying and why they're saying and what they're doing or not doing, where
mm,
it comes from on that particular day at that particular moment. I don't think we would have always a clue. And so to either reject it, judge it, dismiss it, or
mm,
to get angry about those things, I think be unkind. And so I think patience is going to be very, very necessary.
mm,
And simply asking questions in a way that helps you to better understand,
mm,
you know, uh, I find it would be helpful. Okay. Um, Again, if I take my mother's example, there are two things that bug me, and I haven't figured out how to deal with it. One,
mm,
when she comes to the dining table for a meal,
mm, mm,
on that given day, we don't know what
mm,
her palate feels like, given the
mm,
cocktail of medicine she has.
mm,
So what she liked yesterday, today she'll crib about it. And if I
mm,
get upset about it or
mm,
treat it as something where I failed, I think it'll be stupid,
mm, mm,
and say, oh, I've tried my level best to keep you happy, but you're never something like that. Yes, that's one. Second is, you don't, when you talk about what's your ailment of the day or the pain of the day, when you're sitting down to eat, is very hard to deal with. So I think maybe setting up time in a day where you can actually sit down undisturbed,
mm,
to really, walk along for some time with
mm,
somebody who is in your care and in your watch,
mm,
to really help them to be comfortable talking about what's their state of being on
mm,
that given day at that given moment. I think would
mm.
be precious. We don't see that as important enough. I think early enough, and yeah,
Yeah, but that sounds like to me is that it's an act of caring for yourself, because when you are overly focused on caring for the person that you're caring for, then they can, they can come up with their pain points at perhaps a time that you're not ready to receive it. So an
Absolutely.
act of caring for yourself would
Absolutely.
be, and the other person would be, to make sure that that little vent has happened.
Absolutely. I think in the way that you plan your caregiving, you help
Yeah,
yourself.
yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. You help
yeah,
yourself, help your own, what do you call, state of mind,
yeah,
your own stability
yeah.
in the moment, all of that. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And what I could make out was, your quality of self-awareness, that, this bothers me, that don't bring this up at the time that you're having a meal. So let me have this conversation with you. I'm not saying that I will not have this conversation with you, but a better thing for me to do would be to have this conversation at another time.
Yeah. It's desirable, but given where they are in their age at this point in time, some of it is quite unfiltered. So your boundaries are not what are on top of their minds.
For sure. For sure. And I think some humor can go a long way. Uh,
For
and
sure.
some and some kindness, even if, for
Yeah,
example, it is not perfect,
yeah,
uh, is always valuable.
I think so.
I am,
I think so.
yeah, I'm so grateful for your time, and I think we could have a longer conversation. But for sure, I am grateful that we have recorded this conversation. And thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your authentic self always. And I'm looking forward to have a conversation with Auntie.
Sure. Happy to set it up anytime. Anytime.
Yes, we should do that.
Will do. Thank you very much. I learn every time I speak to somebody like you. And so there have been questions that I haven't asked myself often enough or ever before. So I have, in attempting to respond to them, opened some doors. So I'm very grateful to you. So thank you very much. All the very best to you, to Caregiver Sathi, to all your team and everybody else who thinks and whose hearts are out for caregivers. Thank you so much.